Whatever side you came down on, it really doesn't matter, but we ask these hard-hitting questions some week just to get you talking. But both of the, if you look, either side of any of these, it's a textural thing, right? One's harder, one's softer, one's crispy, one's soft, right? There's a texture, or there's smooth, or it's hard. But it's just the idea, this tension between hard and soft, that's going to be our theme today, but it's going to come from our hearts. Not anything exterior, but more with the hearts. The hardness of our hearts, the softness of our hearts. Because today, as we open Mark chapter 10, Jesus will be tested again by those wonderful fellas, the Pharisees, who we heard about. Now, he gets tested about marriage and divorce, really, and he teaches on that. But in this passage specifically, while he teaches about marriage and divorce, it actually goes deeper. So it's almost a teaching within a teaching, because it really comes back to the hardness and softness of heart. So we'll look at kind of both of those things. We'll talk about how Jesus addresses marriage in this context, but also really the hardness and softness of our hearts. Because what happens as followers of Jesus is we very easily have a tendency to start to harden our hearts towards him. And it's really hard to be a follower of Jesus when that happens. A hardened heart makes it hard to be a disciple of Jesus. That's something we got to keep in mind. When our hearts are hardened, it's really hard to follow Jesus. So we're going to look at how our hearts get hardened, one in terms of marriage, and then just in life in general. And then look at softening our hearts, which allows us to follow Jesus more fully, and then actually be firmly and strongly rooted in him. So we're going to start by reading Mark chapter 10. We're going to break our passage up into 3 sections today. Kyle will have it right up there behind me, bookmarked on those Bibles on your table there. If you want to follow along, phone, tablets, computers, whatever you would like. I will be in the NIV translation per usual this morning. So we're going to start with Mark chapter 10. Way to go. We've made it through 9 chapters. We're going to open chapter 10 and start with verses, 1 through 4. It says this: Jesus then left that place and went into the region of Judea and across the Jordan. Again, crowds of people came to him, and as was his custom, he taught them. Some Pharisees came and tested him by asking, "Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife?" "What did Moses command you?" he replied. They said, "Moses permitted a man to write a certificate of divorce and send her away." All right, so Jesus, once again, he's on the move. He's constantly moving. We've seen this a lot. But also now, we kind of want to keep in mind that his life, his ministry is now also physically and kind of where he is moving towards Jerusalem and his eventual arrest, crucifixion, and resurrection. So that's always in our mind. Now, he's moving and he's teaching, as he always does. And people are probably listening pretty well from what we can tell. But the Pharisees show up again. And they show up to test him. They don't come to ask good questions, to learn to deeper their understanding. They want to trap Jesus. They don't like Jesus. And it's to the level where the verb that is used to test him here is the same verb we get from Mark back in chapter 1 when the devil tested Jesus in the wilderness. So it is that level of testing. And the test has to do with a man divorcing his wife, so breaking up of a marriage. Now, this is very strategic coming from the Pharisees. They are in the region that is governed by Herod Antipas. This is the same Herod that had John the Baptist beheaded. We read about that in Mark 6. Well, John got arrested and eventually beheaded because he called out Herod and his marriage to Herodias and the fact that they broke Mosaic law. So they're like, we're in that region. Maybe Jesus will say something stupid or make Herod really upset and he'll get arrested that way. So they're trying to go for this. But Jesus flips the question and he's like, what did Moses command? The Pharisees, very well versed in Mosaic law, so they would know what Moses said. And the Pharisees cite what comes from Deuteronomy 24, 1-4, which is a passage about how a man was permitted to get a certificate of divorce and send his wife away. There were 2 schools of thought kind of on this sending of the wife away, depending on which rabbi you kind of followed. We had a guy named Rabbi Shammai. He was kind of more pretty stringent, pretty strict. It was basically infidelity or adultery. That's the only thing that was permissible to divorce the wife. Then you got this fellow, Rabbi Hillel. He viewed it much more freely. Basically, if a wife did something not to the suiting of the husband, he could send her away. This could be as trivial as, man, she overcooked my lamb last night. And it could be sent away. That is the level Rabbi Hillel came from. So these were grounds for divorce, but it says a divorce certificate was permitted, not endorsed, not encouraged, but permitted. It was a concession by Moses, and Jesus explains that. It was just a concession. Let's keep going. Jesus is going to talk about this. Mark 10, 5-9. It says, "It was because your hearts were hard that Moses wrote you this law," Jesus replied. "But at the beginning of creation, God made them male and female. For this reason, a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife. The two will become one flesh, so they are no longer two, but one flesh. Therefore, what God has joined together, let no one separate. We'll stop there for a minute. It was because the people's hearts were hardened that Moses permitted divorce, gave the certificate of divorce. This was not part of the plan for marriage. It was an accommodation made due to human weakness. And Jesus doesn't dispute it, but he doesn't endorse it. What he does is he goes way back to creation, and he talks about kind of how God intended marriage, the gift that marriage really was. He says God made a male and female, and a man will leave his family, become united to his wife. Those two become one flesh, no longer two, but one. When those two are brought together under God, they're not to be separated. Jesus is kind of teaching marriage was not designed as like a temporary convenience that could just be tossed away when you were done with it. It was meant as a lasting covenant between the two people and under God. Jesus and Moses together, in a sense, say there are times when divorce is tolerated and permitted, but it wasn't the design. Marriage, as it should be, as his command, is about faithfulness to God and each other, peace and love between the two that are joined as one under God. And people weren't supposed to view marriage through the lens of like, what's the permission to get divorced? That's how the Pharisees were seeing it. Being like, okay, we're married, but here's how I can get out later. Jesus wants to view marriage as the covenant relationship that lasts, that is built on being a follower of Jesus and being joined together under God. And we don't get a response from the Pharisees as to how they dealt with this with Jesus, but in the last few verses here, Jesus gives a little more clarification to the disciples. Let's read that, Mark 10:10-12. When they were in the house again, the disciples asked Jesus about this, and he answered, anyone who divorces his wife and marries another woman commits adultery against her. And if she divorces her husband, marries another man, she commits adultery. So the disciples are asking for some clarification when they're alone with Jesus, and he gives a little more direction, he's a little more direct, and he speaks about divorce and remarriage in terms of adultery. There was no doubt in this day about adultery being a sin, and his followers all would have believed in that. So he says if the man just ups and leaves his wife and marries another woman, he commits adultery. Same thing, woman ups, leaves her husband, marries another man, she commits adultery. So if either person divorces and remarries, they've committed adultery against each other. Now, this is actually, it seems like, okay, that's straightforward, but it's actually a big cultural shift in this day. Because in the ancient world, the man was never actually accused of committing adultery against his wife. So if the man left his wife and went and slept with another man's wife, he actually committed adultery against that husband. What Jesus is doing here by including the wife in this is actually giving her that same level the man had. They're on the same playing field. So it's actually more of a protection for the woman. These rights were not recognized in Judaism, but Mark references them here. What Jesus doesn't do is give a list of scenarios when divorce is permitted. We'll touch on those in a little bit. He stays focused on the fact that marriage is meant to be kept together and that the breaking apart of it is a big deal. And it happens when hearts got hardened. So I want to take a look at how our hearts can get hardened, but then how we can soften them and be firmly rooted and have a strong relationship with Jesus. Now, the first has to do with marriage, so we're going to talk about marriage first. But we're going to focus again. Think about this firmly rooted discipleship idea. So marriage as discipleship. And before we dive in to marriage and divorce, I do want to take a minute. I understand how divorce can be a very difficult topic and a sensitive one if you've experienced it in any way. I'm not here at all today to condemn it or to call it out if you've been through it, going through it, family has. That's not the point today. But Jesus did talk about marriage and divorce, so we should too. And Jesus shows he has this really high view of marriage. It's important. It's a gift. It should be taken seriously. It had been made permissible by Moses, and Jesus isn't arguing that. But he's clear those permissions come because of the hardness of hearts and not treating marriage well. So we don't want to look at marriage through the lens of divorce, but rather marriage through the lens of Jesus. Marriage through the lens of discipleship, how we view that as followers of Jesus. And this could be through your own marriage if you're married. If you're not, you know people that are married. So we can see it in this way. So marriage is a gift. We view and steward that gift well. Jesus says in the passage today, the two become united. The two become one. If you've been to a wedding, attended a wedding, you may have seen something like a unity flame, a unity candle, unity sand, where they bring it together. I have a picture up here. Oh, look at those kids. Almost 15 years ago, in a couple of weeks, we did the unity candle. As you can see, there is a big candle in the middle where we each had a candle. We lit the candle together Okay, you look the same and I look way older. That's not fair. You're welcome. But we lit the candle, and then we blew out our own candles. Yeah, right. Listen, the beard's gotten grayer and grayer. We all know it. Like, my kids notice it. I notice it. I'm embracing it. I'm going to kill the salt and pepper look anyway. That's a different thing. But we blew out our individual candles because those two flames became one. That's the whole idea. Two people become one under God. The married couple makes a promise, makes a covenant to each other. We use that word covenant a lot. It's a promise under God, and it's firmly rooted in God. The husband and wife are to love each other like they love God. And we often talk about how we show the love of God, how it's an action. It's not just emotion, but it's shown, it's action. The same thing for husbands and wives. One action is sacrifice. Give up something for the person you're married to. Put aside something of yours, something of you for your spouse in your marriage. Now, you're not giving up everything that makes you you or everything you need, but there is sacrifice in marriage because it's not just about you. It's not just about number one anymore because those two became one. Service is another action. Serving your spouse. Do things for your spouse. Help your spouse. Ask them, what do you need from me? That is 6 words. None of them are longer than 4 letters. I think we can all understand them. But then listen. Listen to what they say. I need you to make dinner 2 nights a week. I need you to do more getting the kids ready for bed. I need you to give me some downtime after work. I need us to go on a date. I need you to put your phone down and look at me when you have a conversation. Respond. Hear them and then respond. Serve your spouse by meeting the needs of your spouse. That's loving them and loving God. And then offering grace. Offering grace is an action. None of us in here are perfect. That includes your spouse, except for mine. Okay? Killing it today, aren't I? Killing it. Our spouses may hurt us in some way at times. Now, I'm not talking about like persistent abuse here, but maybe they lose their cool and say something that hurts you. Maybe they frustrate you. Maybe your spouse annoys you. This all happens because we all have our faults. So to our spouses, please don't start making a mental list of them right now. But we do need to have grace for them. You should talk to your spouse about them. Yes, communicate with your spouse, but offer grace. See, we communicate with God through prayer, and he offers grace. We communicate with our spouses. We should offer and receive grace, sacrifice, service, grace, all aspects of showing God's love. And we do that for God. We do that for our spouses. We do that as a way to honor the marriage covenant and keep it firmly rooted in God. But what happens when somebody breaks that covenant? Their heart has been hardened towards the covenant, and it gets broken. Here's where Moses starts listing the permissions for divorce. And again, not the design, but what Moses or God intended. Jesus doesn't list or make a list of this, but I do think it's important to maybe mention a few. Not saying these have to lead to divorce or endorsing it, but these are some that possibly we could see as breaking that covenant. The one that gets brought up the most, probably infidelity or cheating on the spouse. Marriage is a covenant between the two, and one has a relationship with somebody outside of that marriage that breaks the covenant. Abuse, physical, mental, emotional. When one person abuses the other, this is not kindness or love or honor, which is promised in marriage. God, I do not at all believe, would command a person to stay in an abusive relationship. Abandonment. Somebody just ups and leaves. It's really hard to love, to sacrifice, and serve someone if you've completely abandoned them. Abandonment, I see, is breaking the covenant of marriage. So there are a few things just to keep in mind, but again, the focus and the view of marriage should be on keeping that covenant, not on the permissions of divorce. Marriage as a part of discipleship and soft hearts in our marriage that firmly root us in our marriages and to Jesus. But that hardening of the hearts doesn't only happen in marriage. So I want to expand it a little bit. Let's look at just the general hardening of the hearts. This phrase, harden of the hearts, is used throughout the Bible to describe an unresponsiveness or stubbornness or an unwillingness to follow God. In the Old Testament, Pharaoh's heart, it says, was hardened when he refused to free the Israelites from slavery. Jesus even questions the disciples about their hearts being hardened in Mark 8 when they're complaining and arguing about the fact that they don't have any bread. Jesus asks them, have your hearts been hardened, and do you not yet understand? We all know I love to cook and to make things and to be in the kitchen. When I do desserts, which I do a little bit, not a lot, I do like to dip things in white chocolate, always white chocolate, because my daughter doesn't like regular chocolate, and she gets what she wants from daddy. So we work with white chocolate. But here's the thing. To dip in white chocolate, you got to melt it down, right? So it's a smooth consistency. Again, smooth. See, we're going smooth. White chocolate doesn't take much to seize up, right? And it firms up, it gets clumpy, and it hardens, and you can't do anything with it. A little bit of water, low-quality chocolate, too high heat. If you are not paying attention to it, it will seize up, firm up, and you can't use it. It will harden very quickly. Our hearts towards Jesus can seize up and harden really quickly and really easily if we're not paying attention. They harden when we're no longer impacted by the words of Jesus, when we're no longer following those words of Jesus and the presence of him in our lives. We aren't guided by him. We aren't using the gifts he's giving us well. So how do we spot this? How do we know what's happening? Well, one way is to see what's coming out of us and what's not coming out of us. Meaning, how are we acting? How are we behaving? One thing to look at, do we see the fruits of the Spirit, as they're called, coming out of our lives? The Apostle Paul in Galatians 5:22-23 says, the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, forbearance, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. Are those coming out of our lives? Paul writes that these come out when we live a life by the Spirit and belong to Jesus. And to see this, we have to step outside of ourselves a little bit or let others honestly tell us what they see in our lives. If we're losing patience really quickly or a lot, if we're not talking kindly to others, being super brash, those are signs we're not displaying the fruits of the Spirit. And then we look at, are we displaying what Paul calls the acts of the flesh? Galatians 5:19-21, just before those fruits of the Spirit, he says, the acts of the flesh are obvious: sexual immorality, impurity, and debauchery, idolatry, and witchcraft, hatred, discord, jealousy, fits of rage, selfish ambition, dissensions, factions, envy, drunkenness, orgies, and the like. So are any of these actually coming out in any way? Impurity, debauchery, drunkenness. Does one drink with your friends always turn into a rager? Are the looks at people you find attractive, do they linger for too long? Are you getting jealous and angry at the success of others, the recognition of those around you? Is everything you do or say, every conversation always come back to everything being about you in a selfish manner? The acts of the flesh, according to Paul, these are obvious. It's like they're there. If we're willing to look at ourselves and allow people to speak truth to us, we can see these. These come out as our hearts are hardened to Jesus. And then are you misusing or wasting a gift from God? This is also a signal of a hardened heart. Using a gift from God only for money or for notoriety or for selfish reasons. You can and you absolutely might make money off of a gift from God or be seen and known while using a gift from God for God. That can happen. The issue comes in if you're passing up ways to serve God with a gift he gave you just to serve yourself. That's misusing it. Or it can be an unwillingness to use a gift you've been given to serve. You have a gift, there's a known need. You have a gift that can serve that need, and for no real reason other than you just don't want to or you'd rather do something else, you say no. Misusing and wasting gifts from God are signs of a hardened heart, just like acts of the flesh, and not displaying the fruits of the Spirit. We need not hard hearts for God, but soft hearts for God. How do we soften them? A soft heart actually equals a firm commitment to God. We aren't trying to sidestep teachings from God. We aren't looking for the concessions to the teachings, and the fruits of the Spirit are coming out of our lives. It happens when we've softened our hearts to God. And to some degree, all of us have or will experiencing a harden of the heart. So we need to think about how do we soften something that's been hardened. My daughter Joella had this fidget in her bed for a while. I don't even know what it was. But somehow it would firm up and it would adhere, and it got stuck to her blankets and her sheets, and we had to get it off. It was like it had hardened up. I didn't know what it was, but it was there, and we're like, how do we get this off without cutting and ripping the sheets or the blankets? What we had to do is we had to soak it. We put it in a bunch of water. And when I soaked it like this and let it sit for a while, eventually I could kind of peel it off slowly without ripping it, but it took time. It had to soak. It had to soften so we could peel it off. We need to soak our hearts with the presence of Jesus to soften them. Talk to him, connect with him, listen to him, just be with Jesus and in his presence. And what has to and usually will come first before we soften is the breaking down of the hardness of the heart. This part can be difficult, it can be painful, it can take time, depending on where you are in that process. And it might hurt a little bit to break through it, but that's what God will help us through to get to softened hearts. If the hardness has come from selfishness and pride, God's got to break down the wall we've built around ourselves, smash the mirrors that cause us to only see ourselves and nobody else. It can be hard to lay down the desire for importance and recognition and praise and constant high fives or fist bumps. But God is a God of humility. He helps us do that by reminding us of humility, and being in his presence, soaked with his presence, helps us do that. If the hardness of your heart comes from a party till you drop, say what you want, you only live once lifestyle, God's got to break through that lifestyle to show you that you have an important and valuable life right here. But the purpose of our life here is to glorify and worship God so that we can have eternal life and eternal community with him. That might mean friendships end or change. The things you do for enjoyment or entertainment might change. Attitudes might change. The way you see and relate and talk about others might change. I've used the word change a lot, and some of us really don't like that word. Say, no, not change. I fear change. I don't want change. Change can feel like a swear word. I was in a training a few weeks ago with a guy named Todd Bolsinger, who's a pastor and author, and he brought up change. And he said, here's the thing. People don't resist change. They resist loss. People don't resist change, they resist loss. Because when we change, we actually lose something. In the scenarios we just talked about, that change, we may lose a friendship, lose a form of enjoyment, lose a bunch of likes or shares on social media. But we also might lose that hardness of our hearts. Then that loss leads to gain. We gain softness. All my fellow gym rats out there are like, bro, what are you on? Gains are about firm and hard and strong, right? Those are the gains. But remember, Jesus flipped everything upside down. Losing hardness to gain softness. Our hearts become like a softened soil that's ready for God to seed, to water, to give nutrients to, and produce the fruit he's intended. The fruit of the Spirit that comes out when we're connected to Jesus and living as a disciple of him. We soften our hearts to him, but that firmly roots us to him. Soft hearts for strong discipleship. We'll wrap up here. Remember to view marriage as part of discipleship. Love each other as you love God. Keep the focus on the covenant and the promise made to each other and before God. And then the hardening of hearts. We can't follow Jesus well when our hearts are hardened. So are the fruits of the Spirit not coming out in your life? Are the acts of the flesh what's on display? Are we using the gifts God has given us for God or just for ourselves? And then think about softening your heart and going through that. Let your heart be soaked by God. Break down the hardness that's around your heart. Be softened and gain the full presence of Jesus. Let the fruits of a life devoted to him come out and be visible in your life. Be that soft soil, but be firmly rooted in Jesus. Don't make being a disciple of Jesus harder than it is by having a hardened heart. Soften your heart and be a strong disciple of Jesus. Let's pray. God, we thank you for this morning. And God, mostly we just thank you that as our hearts have hardened or are hardened or will harden, that we can always come to you. And you allow us to soften them again. God, you work through us to soften our hearts again to you. So I would pray just that this morning, God, that in any way that any of our hearts have become hardened towards you, that today you would put on our hearts to soften them, to invite you back into our lives, to invite more of you into our lives, God, to be soaked in your presence, God, in your grace, in your mercy, and your love. You would soften our hearts so we could be strong and true disciples of you. So God, I thank you again for this morning. Thank you for the opportunity to come before you and that you will soften our hearts, God. We thank you for this morning. In your name, amen.